Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Ms. Lisa Dalton, Director of Financing and Partnership Division, Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite the following to participate in this meeting: His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, and His Excellency Mr. Paul Beresford-Hill, Permanent Observer of the Sovereign Order of Malta to the United Nations. It is so decided. The Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Lisa Dalton.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, members of the Security Council, thank you for this opportunity to update you on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. This discussion is particularly urgent as the conflict and its catastrophic impacts grind on into another winter. Daily attacks continue, inflicting death, injury, and untold suffering on ordinary Ukrainians, and destruction and damage to civilian infrastructure. Near the front line, people live life on the edge. They face constant shelling and impossible choices, flee in perilous conditions, leaving everything they have, perhaps for the second or third time, or stay and risk injury or death. This is no idle concern. Dozens of civilians have been killed in recent attacks in the regions of Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Kharkiv, Kherson, joining the thousands whose lives have already been claimed by this brutal war. And as the use of long-range weapons has steadily increased since July, so has the civilian toll. November saw a particularly deadly increase. Last month, long-range weapons killed 65 civilians and injured 372 across 11 regions of Ukraine, double the number of October. Madam President, as temperatures start to drop as low as minus 20 degrees Celsius in some places, our concerns for civilians intensifies, particularly in light of widespread damage to critical infrastructure. Since March this year, Russian armed forces have conducted repeated, large-scale, coordinated attacks against Ukraine's energy infrastructure. According to UNDP, more than 60% of energy generation facilities have now been damaged. Going into the coldest months of the year, civilians' access to electricity, gas, heating, and water have been severely affected. These impacts are exacerbated by a simultaneous and equally egregious increase in attacks harming humanitarian operations. Humanitarian offices, vehicles, storage facilities, and relief supplies have all been damaged, and humanitarian workers have not been spared. This year, the number of humanitarian aid workers killed in Ukraine has almost tripled, from 4 in 2022 and 5 in 2023 to 11 so far in 2024. Madam President, across Ukraine, some 14.6 million people currently need humanitarian assistance. 10 million people have now been displaced. Of these, 3.5 million people are being hosted in communities across every one of Ukraine's 24 regions, and around 6.5 million are refugees in other countries. This displacement is having a disproportionately negative impact on women and girls, particularly older women. Their exposure to gender-based violence has been heightened, and their access to support services hindered. Madam President, grappling with the freezing conditions and the dangers posed by missile attacks, the humanitarian community is doing all it can to provide people with the support they need. In 2024, more than 630 humanitarian organizations have provided at least one form of assistance to 7.7 million people across Ukraine. This includes essential support for the most vulnerable, the elderly, those with disabilities, and displaced people living in collective centers or along the front line. And OCHA and our humanitarian partners are working to increase funding to women's organizations, recognizing their critical role in the provision of life-saving care, safe spaces, and advocacy for women's rights amid conflict. Under the 2024-2025 Winter Response Plan, Aid workers have also so far provided winter-related assistance to more than 144,000 people. 33% are older people, and 9% are people with disabilities. This assistance includes essential household repairs, support for water and heating systems, and providing access to safe and warm shelter for those that are displaced. Madam President, we're extremely concerned about the plight of an estimated 1.5 million civilians in need of support in the parts of the regions of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, Zaporizhia under Russian Federation occupation. We remain unable to reach these people at any adequate scale. The failure to deliver assistance in these areas could have dire consequences, especially in winter. As we've said before, under international humanitarian law, all parties must allow and facilitate the rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need and must ensure that humanitarian personnel have the freedom of movement required for their work. It's crucial that we're able to bring relief to those who need it wherever they are. Madam President, here's what we need from the international community. 1, unequivocal commitment to and compliance with international humanitarian law, encompassing the protection of civilians and civilian objects, including humanitarian personnel and assets, and unimpeded humanitarian access to people in need. 2, funding. So far in 2024, donors have generously contributed almost $2 billion to the humanitarian response. However, there's still a substantial $1.1 billion shortfall. To sustain humanitarian operations in an increasingly complex and dangerous environment, we urgently need donors to increase and accelerate flexible funding for the response going into 2025. And 3, as long as this intolerable war persists, civilians will continue to suffer the severe consequences. What Ukraine and its people need is an end to this devastating war. I thank you.
I thank Ms. Dalton for her statement. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam President, I wish to thank, first of all, Ms. Lisa Doughton from OCHA for her briefing. For more than 1,000 days now, Russia has been continuing its war of aggression against Ukraine in flagrant defiance of the United Nations Charter and international law. For more than 3 years now, it has continued to deliberately target civilian populations and civilian objects in violation of IHL. France condemns Russia's indiscriminate strikes. They continue to be ratcheted up against civilians. That was again the case on the 10th of December in Zaporizhia, and we saw strikes against energy infrastructure of Ukraine. More than half of the Ukrainian electricity generation capacity has today been destroyed or damaged. That has forced the Ukrainian people to face a third bitter winter in the cold. Russians' long-range strikes deep into the heartlands are far from the front lines and do not target direct military targets. Rather, they target civilian infrastructures that meet the essential needs of millions of Ukrainian people. These strikes violate IHL. We recall that it is incumbent upon Russia to uphold IHL and the humanitarian principles of distinction and proportionality. Russia must cease its deliberate strikes against civilians and civilian infrastructure. Madam President, France condemns the war crimes committed in Ukraine. Russia utilizes sexual violence as a weapon of war. Russia has forcibly transferred and deported Ukrainian children. Russia is once again listed in the latest annual report of the SG on children and armed conflicts. Russia is responsible for manifold human rights violations in occupied territories and for violations of humanitarian law against Ukrainian prisoners of war. The fate of 1.5 million Ukrainian people in the occupied territories is of concern. Russia must allow the access of humanitarian organizations to those people. Madam President, since the first day of the Russian war of aggression, France has supported Ukraine and its neighbouring countries against the humanitarian consequences of the conflict. France has mobilised more than €400 million in order to meet emergency humanitarian needs and guarantee the restoration of essential infrastructure. We remain determined to continue to help Ukraine as intensely and for as long as is necessary, so that Ukraine is able to exercise its right to self-defence and to ensure that Russia's war of aggression is brought down once and for all. France remains committed to upholding IHL and international human rights law. France hails the conclusion of Ukraine's ratification process of the ICC's Rome Statute. France reaffirms its support for the ICC as well as for the Ukrainian courts in order to guarantee that those responsible for crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine are held accountable. Respecting these rights is an integral part of a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in accordance with the resolutions adopted by the UN General Assembly. I thank you.
The representative of France for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to thank Ms. Doughton for her briefing. Since the beginning of the invasion in Ukraine, more than 12,000 civilians have lost their lives and 27,000 have been wounded. Hundreds of thousands of combatants have died, almost 4 million people remained internally displaced, and over 6.8 million have fled from Ukraine. In the Russian region of Kursk, 130,000 civilians have had to be evacuated as a result of hostilities, and many have lost their lives. 40% of the Ukrainian population depends on humanitarian assistance, and 55% of that number is women and girls. Many of these people are at risk of gender-based violence and exploitation. More than 60% of Ukraine's electrical generation facilities have been damaged, and that has left millions of people unable to access electricity or heating in the midst of a bitter winter. Children have been the most vulnerable victims of this conflict. The psychological impact of living under constant shelling, in addition to displacement and the loss of loved ones, defies comprehension. The establishment of psychosocial support programs, as well as the strengthening of child protection networks and the full participation of women, must be central pillars of all post-conflict recovery initiatives. Ultimately, what we're seeing is a constant threat hovering over the civilian population, particularly in communities closest to the front lines of this unjustifiable war. President, colleagues, against this backdrop, the work of the United Nations and of humanitarian organizations has been a beacon of hope for millions of people. I expressed Ecuador's deep thanks to all humanitarian personnel working in Ukraine, and I reiterate our appeal for the implementation of Resolution 2730, as well as of all resolutions pertaining to the protection of humanitarian personnel. As co-penholder of the humanitarian file in Ukraine over the last 2 years, Ecuador has advocated for a person-centered approach, and one which focuses on mitigating human suffering at a critical global juncture, at a time when we're seeing a dizzying rise in conflicts which deliberately erode global norms and structures designed to protect civilians. Ecuador will time and time again hammer home the obligation that parties have to protect the civilian population, protect civilian infrastructures, and comply with the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution as provided for under international humanitarian law. The recent attack against IAEA personnel on the road leading to the Zaporizhzhia power plant is deplorable, and Ecuador calls upon parties to exercise the utmost restraint in order to avoid a nuclear disaster, even an accidental one. Madam President, Excellencies, whilst Ecuador's mandate as an elected member of this Council is coming to an end, our commitment to the principles we have upheld remains here and remains unwavering. On the 24th of February 2022, the central principles of the Charter were violated. That is, independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of a state. They were violated. Colleagues, the invasion of Ukraine defied once again, yet again, another fundamental principle of international law, namely, the fact that there can be no territorial conquest through the use of force. Such conquest is null and void. There can be no such conquest through the use of force. Ecuador is convinced that even when military action is undertaken, efforts designed to adopt diplomatic and political measures to resolve the problem must continue and even be stepped up. The civilized conscience of humankind and that of all peoples of our globe repudiate war. Diplomacy, hearing the cries of the people, must leverage its full determination in the quest for peaceful and good faith solutions. History has taught us that to build a genuine peace, we must examine the roots of a conflict, just as we must current and future circumstances. Despite the fact that parties seem to be digging in their heels to resolve conflicts using military means, we must remain unwavering in our search for negotiated solutions which make peace possible through the restoration of the rule of law. This war has gone on for too long, and as it intensifies, the number of victims and suffering will only increase. I wish to conclude once again reiterating how grateful Ecuador is to the Secretary General for his efforts to bring about peace. Once again, I beseech this Council and the international community to step up their diplomatic efforts to put an end to this war, so that once and for all we can bury the spectre that is the nuclear threat. The people of Ukraine, the people of Russia, and the world are calling for, and they deserve, peace. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, we see today's meeting as a desperate attempt by the sponsors and the puppeteers of the Kiev regime to keep Ukraine afloat as a topic in the Security Council. And this under conditions when a large part of the international community is objectively losing interest in this topic. This comes as no surprise because of late, the Ukrainian President Zelensky, past his expiration date, managed to discredit the Kiev authorities to such an extent that it's only Ukraine's accomplices who dare to express support for it, those who inspired and supported the anti-constitutional coup d'etat in February of 2014. We all had an opportunity to see for ourselves the former comedian going to great pains to kowtow before the Republicans who won the US election. He's been trying to shift the focus from the fact that Kiev had bet on the Democrats. Zelensky and his team have been traveling across the US and its satellites with their hands outstretched, trying to secure the understanding that the new administration will not throw them under the bus. The sour expressions on the faces of Kiev officials can be explained not by the fact that they haven't managed to get a new license to rule, nor are they explained by the fact that they're receiving signals about an inevitable decrease in military support. They are explained by the fact that there might be an audit conducted of the US money that's already been spent on Ukraine. This is the most frightening scenario for the Ukrainian authorities, mired in corruption. We've warned about this many times. This was recently reconfirmed by the new appointee for the incoming administration, the head of the FBI, Kash Patel. He said that I would ask Congress to investigate where this money went. The American people should get an answer to this. How can we trust this government when we give such large sums and do not receive reports on what they're spent on? End of quote. Mr. Kash Patel also intends to figure out whether the Ukrainian president used false security threats to get financial assistance from the US. It's worth noting that the Western media and the few independent media left in Ukraine are united in their assessment of the fact that this audit only spells trouble for the Ukrainian leadership and for their democratic accomplices. It comes as no surprise that they are now engaged in a frenzy of activity. The National Security Advisor of President Biden, Jake Sullivan, was blunt. He said that the outgoing administration is going to do everything to give Ukraine every instrument to continue strengthening its position on the battlefield. He clarified that he is referring to en masse supplies of military equipment to spend every dollar which Congress has allocated by the time Biden leaves office, end of quote. Let me remind you that he's referring to a drawdown of $6.5 billion. However, as Western experts have pointed out, we're not referring to actual supplies of weapons to the Kiev regimes. It's practically impossible to do this in such a short period of time. What they're referring to is about how they're going to split the pie, how they're going to get kickbacks, which the incoming Trump administration intends to crack down on. We advise everybody to get their popcorn ready. There's going to be a lot of fuss in the coming months. The supplies of Western weapons and Western support to keep the Kiev posse afloat is something we're going to discuss at a separate meeting, which we've requested for the 20th of December. Colleagues, according to a recent Gallup poll, over half of Ukrainians are in favor of ending the conflict as soon as possible and are ready to accept inevitable territorial concessions. We know how biased Western sociologists are, which means we have every reason to believe that the real figure is much higher. The real sentiments in Ukrainian society can be seen in the fact that over 100,000 people have deserted, and Ukrainians on the whole are unwilling to fight for this inhumane, corrupt regime which has usurped power in Ukraine in violation of the constitution. It is also confirmed by the fact that Ukrainians have been fleeing the free-for-all unleashed by the Ukrainian authorities, moving to Russia en masse, returning to ex-Ukrainian territories which are now part of Russia. Having picked up on these sentiments and receiving signals from Washington which are not reassuring, the heads of the Kiev junta have of late lowered expectations. They, and specifically the president, are not waxing lyrical as much about the peace plan. They're talking about ideas about how we can settle the crisis. This showy peace-loving should do nothing to fool us. They are united in the fact there is a common denominator. All of these ideas are a rehash of the Zelensky formula. Also, they are impossible to implement in practice, as they do not address the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis. In fact, this, just like the ideas of the turncoat Western politicians, all of this boils down to freezing the conflict along the contact line, giving up the territories which are now part of Russia, as well as security guarantees. The latest thing on the wish list of the Ukrainian president is to get from Joe Biden, before he leaves the White House, an invitation from NATO for Ukraine's territory within its internationally recognized borders, and to ensure that NATO's guarantees would extend to that part of Ukraine which the country currently controls, with potential for future expansion, end of quote. Even if we cast aside this very rich idea, we'd like to remind you that no freezing of the conflict with the Russian Federation is agreeable to us. We saw for ourselves with the Minsk agreements that we cannot trust neither the Kiev junta nor the West. We understand full well that the whole point of this exercise is to give the regime in Kiev a breather on the battlefield so that they can lick their wounds and rearm. There can be no discussion about NATO having a role in settling the Ukrainian crisis. NATO and the prospects of membership therein have been part of the problem since the very beginning, not part of the solution. If we analyze this new mindset, which the president has recently espoused, we call everyone to look at what's happening, not at what people are saying. And here everything is clear. Through its actions, the Kiev regime is continuing to opt for confrontation and raising the stakes. This is confirmed by the ongoing strikes using Western high-precision weapons, including the strikes on the 11th and 13th of December on military objects in Taganrog and Orel, using long-range Western missiles. Let me remind you that in an interview to Time magazine, Donald Trump said that these actions were stupid and a serious escalation. He said, and I quote, "I disagree very vehemently with sending missiles hundreds of miles into Russia. Why are we doing that? We're just escalating this war and making it worse." End of quote. We hope that these words uttered by the incoming president will be commented on by our US colleagues today. The Ukrainian leadership, past its expiration date, does not want to resolve the situation, and in fact they repudiated Hungary's proposal to introduce a Christmas ceasefire and an exchange of prisoners. On our side, we drew up a list of prisoners, but the Zelensky regime once again rudely, categorically rejected to take over 600 Ukrainian servicemen back. They've been in Russia for over a year. It's an open secret that ordinary Ukrainians who ended up on the front owing to the forcible mobilization, are of no concern to the Kiev regime. They only want to trade militias from nationalist battalions as well as foreign mercenaries, which took part in military hostilities against Russia. The last thing I want to say about these pseudo-peace initiatives from the president, I'd like to remind everyone that the decree dated October 2022 banning negotiations with the Russian leadership has to date not been revoked. So draw your own conclusions as to whether Ukraine's statements and calls are genuine. We don't rule out the fact that they are possibly a smokescreen for yet another escalation, as was the case in July and August of this year, just before the Ukrainians entered the Kursk Oblast. Madam President, we'd like to use this opportunity to draw members' attention to an incident that occurred with an IAEA Secretariat vehicle on the 10th of December. This occurred during a planned rotation of IAEA experts at the ZNPP. There were strikes on a vehicle that was transporting IAEA staff. The Russian motorcade was going back after it drove experts to the contact line, and it was also attacked. Thankfully, there were no victims. During rotations, and this is in fact the 25th rotation, the Russian Federation takes upon itself to ensure a truce and provides security guarantees to all staff. The Ukrainians have violated these obligations on a number of occasions, including in June and November of last year and in April of this year. According to IAEA Information Circular 264, the incident occurred when staff were driving across territory controlled by Ukraine to an area where they were supposed to cross the contact line. The driver saw an uncrewed aerial vehicle approaching from behind, so from the north where Ukrainian formations are stationed. Let me clarify that this occurred in the run-up to an emergency session of the Board of Governors of the IAEA called by Ukraine. We unequivocally condemn this provocation on the part of the Kiev regime, which put at risk the lives of IAEA staff and Russian servicemen, which were ensuring the rotation run smoothly. We call on international organizations and the international community to condemn yet another instance of Ukraine flagrantly violating international humanitarian law. Madam President, I must also comment, by way of conclusion, an incident on the 10th of December 2024 when the Solomensk court of the city of Kiev issued a sentence vis-à-vis a Ukrainian human rights defender, Ms. Elena Berezhnaya. She's well known the world over. A 70-year-old human rights defender, an anti-fascist activist, she was sentenced to 14 years behind bars and the confiscation of her property. Prior to this, she was in detention for over 2.5 years, and in fact, in pretrial detention, she was tortured. Let me remind you, the Zelensky regime filed proceedings immediately after Elena spoke at an informal RA meeting, UN Security Council meeting called by the Russian Federation on the 22nd of December 2021. The basis for the sentence that was handed down was a letter Ms. Berezhnaya sent to the UN, which I quoted on the 28th of March 2022 at a General Assembly meeting. In other words, the Kiev regime is, before our very eyes, cracking down on this human rights defender because she spoke at our invitation here at the UN and also penned a letter to our organization criticizing the human rights situation in Ukraine. I'm interested to see whether today some of our Western colleagues, those who under different circumstances show such deep concern about the safety of briefers who've been invited by the UN, whether they'll exhibit an iota of conscience and courage to give an honest assessment of these actions on the part of Zelensky and his posse. Colleagues, we hope that those among you who really do seek peace in Ukraine, after my statement today, will have no illusions left about what Zelensky is really trying to achieve, what his posse is trying to achieve, and that you will see how far they are from bringing peace to Ukraine. Zelensky and his posse are prepared to sacrifice all of their citizens, to mobilize women and children just to hold on to power and to evade punishment for the crimes they've committed against their people. But the end of the criminal and rapacious regime is near. The front line is coming undone across the board. The territory under Ukraine's control is shrinking by the day. Meanwhile, Ukrainians are more actively seeking peace and refusing to go and fight. Our conditions for ending the conflict are clear and logical. They have nothing to do with those surrogate formulas, which do nothing to address the threat that Kiev poses for Russia. Formulas which of late have been very actively promoted by Kiev's Western allies. While they do this promotion work, we will continue to pursue the objectives of our special military operations by military means and respond to Kiev's provocations just like we did on the 13th of December. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I would like to thank Ms. Lisa Doughton from OCHA for her valuable briefing. As we meet today, the conflict in Ukraine continues unabated, and it continues to claim innocent lives of civilians in a protracted war, with numerous consequences on Ukraine and Russia. Meanwhile, there are no prospects for a peaceful settlement between the two parties. Reports abound about the heavy losses in lives, property, and infrastructure, including energy infrastructure. The targeting of energy infrastructure is causing enormous damage, especially during the extremely harsh winter. This creates conditions that are impossible to endure, especially by women and children. This targeting also disrupts vital facilities, such as health and educational institutions, supply chains, and others, further exacerbating the impact on civilians. What is even worse is that this war still answers the logic of confrontation, escalation, and polarization. The two parties are still looking for means to strengthen their military capabilities in an attempt to achieve a better position in a war which, like other wars, will have no winner. Madam President, Algeria has been calling and continues to call for sobriety, pause, and self-restraint, and to giving the utmost priority to the life and safety of civilians. It calls upon both parties to strictly abide by the rules of international law, including international humanitarian law, which both prohibit the targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure. Algeria has also been calling for de-escalation and for favoring dialogue, inclusive and constructive dialogue, in view of achieving a lasting and just peace. Algeria reaffirms its firm belief that the solution will not happen through the force of weapons, but through negotiations and the ability of both parties to overcome their differences and to find a peaceful settlement that would put an end to the war. In this context, we reiterate our call to both parties to give a chance to diplomacy, to engage in a constructive, inclusive negotiation that aims at immediately putting an end to hostile operations and finding a just and lasting solution based on the principles and purposes of the United Nations Charter, in the primacy of which we all believe, while taking into account the legitimate security concerns of both parties. We also call upon the international community to multiply their diplomatic efforts, aiming at creating a conducive environment for negotiations away from polarization and narrow geopolitical considerations. In conclusion, Algeria reaffirms its unwavering commitment to support all international efforts aiming at finding a peaceful political settlement accepted by both parties to put an end to this war and to return the whole region to safety. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I now give the floor to the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I extend my gratitude to Director Doughton for the timely briefing. We also welcome the participation of Permanent Representative of Ukraine in today's meeting. President, Ukrainians once again are enduring harsh winter conditions brought on by Russia's merciless attacks. Targeting critical infrastructure has been Russia's main tactic throughout this unjustifiable war. The fact that Russia does not spare residential areas, health and education facilities, or cultural sites clearly demonstrates the immoral and illegal nature of this war. Russia has been increasingly relying on North Korean munitions and troops in the war, and we are carefully watching recent news reports that about 30 North Korean troops were killed or wounded in the Kursk region. Against this troubling backdrop, I'd like to make the following points. First, we condemn Russia's widespread, systematic, and disproportionate attacks against the energy infrastructure, which aggravate the humanitarian situation in Ukraine by significantly marring electricity generation and transmission capacity. We are appalled by the massive aerial attack by Russia last Friday against energy facilities across Ukraine, which involved about 90 missiles, including one from North Korea, and over 200 drones. This is part of Russia's escalated strike campaign targeting energy infrastructure that picked up pace last March. Indeed, according to UNHCR, Ukraine has lost about 65% of its power generation capacity. This is enough to supply electricity to more than 20 million people in the most advanced countries. This immense destruction of energy infrastructure leads to the disruption of other essential services, such as heating, water supply, and sanitation. It has also seriously jeopardized public health care and education systems. Second, we emphasize that targeting civilian infrastructure indispensable to the survival of the civilian population constitutes a clear violation of international humanitarian law, as articulated in Article 54 of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions. It is in this context that the UN Independent Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine concluded that Russian armed forces had committed the war crime of excessive incidental death, injury, or damage. In this regard, my delegation supports international efforts to hold those responsible for such atrocities accountable. Third, we are deeply worried about risks to the stable operation of nuclear power plants, as Russia has recently stepped up its attacks against substations and transmission facilities directly connected to nuclear power plants in Ukraine. This has led to a significant reduction of electricity generation in Ukraine and even risks the most devastating consequences that this war could possibly cause, a grave nuclear accident. In this regard, we echo the IAEA Secretary General's concerns about the safety of Ukraine's nuclear power plants. Russia must immediately stop its attacks on them. Madam President, Russia's illegal invasion has already caused unbearable suffering for the people of Ukraine. Moreover, its impacts keep reverberating across the global community, undermining energy and food security worldwide. Russia must end this war by immediately withdrawing its troops from the internationally recognized territories of Ukraine. For our part, the Republic of Korea is committed to joining the international community's efforts to support Ukraine based on our bilateral Ukraine Peace and Solidarity Initiative. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to thank Director Doughton for her briefing. Madam President, anywhere we look, we see signs of the war intensifying. In the past year, the situation on the ground has been continuously worsening for the civilian population, with a significant increase in civilian casualties. The Human Rights Monitoring Mission to Ukraine verified over 1,400 deaths and injuries in September alone, the highest number in 2 years. Civilians in frontline and displaced communities already face dire living conditions, and with winter setting in, the situation is deteriorating by the day. While the humanitarian needs of the civilian population are growing, humanitarian access is in peril as a result of increasing insecurity and attacks against humanitarian facilities. World Food Programme alone has reported losing access to 160 frontline communities. In more than 1,000 days of war, WHO has verified over 2,100 attacks against healthcare facilities, a direct violation of IHL. And in 2024, casualties of health workers and patients from these attacks have nearly tripled compared to last year. At the same time, Russia is continuing with its campaign of destruction of Ukraine's civilian energy infrastructure. Since the last time we met on this topic in September, over 5,000 air, missile, and drone strikes were recorded across Ukraine. The figure has almost doubled in comparison to the same period of 2023. Many of these attacks have been targeting energy infrastructure, decimating Ukraine's power and heat generation capacity. 8 power plants and over 800 heat supply facilities, all gone. Now, Russia moved onto the power grid again. Late last month, nearly 200 missiles and drones were launched, leaving more than 1 million households without power. The situation further deteriorating just a few days ago. As temperatures plunged below 0 degrees centigrade across Ukraine, Russia launched one of its largest aerial attacks, with nearly 300 drones and missiles, again, directed against civilian energy infrastructure. These hideous attacks are clearly not directed against legitimate military targets and are an evident violation of the international humanitarian law. Colleagues, grave violations of international humanitarian and human rights law must not go unpunished, and the perpetrators must be brought to justice. Madam President, the attacks against the energy grid are raising severe concerns about the safety and security of Ukraine's nuclear facilities. Slovenia strongly condemns the attacks. A stable electricity grid is essential to ensure nuclear safety at Ukraine's operating nuclear power plants. Colleagues, a nuclear accident in the midst of war would be catastrophic for Ukraine, devastating for the wider region, and would have global impacts. And this Council should make every effort to prevent it. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Director Doughton for the update and echo her concern about the grave humanitarian impact of this war. The sobering statistics heard this afternoon once again underscore the fact that civilians are bearing the brunt of this conflict. Despite repeated calls by the international community for full adherence to international humanitarian law and the principles of distinction, precaution, and proportionality, civilians continued to be harmed in indiscriminate attacks and civilian infrastructure destroyed. Moreover, the continuous attacks against energy infrastructure heightened concerns about more power outages in the cold winter months. These attacks have already disrupted access to essential services across Ukraine, impacting the most vulnerable, older people, low-income households, people with disabilities, and those who are internally displaced. This situation cannot be allowed to continue. The parties must uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law, including the prohibition on deliberate and direct attacks against civilians and other protected persons and objects. We call for immediate action to ensure full, unhindered humanitarian access, including in occupied areas, and call upon the international community to use whatever influence possible to urge the parties to comply with their obligations under international law. Madam President, Guyana also registers its grave concern about the precarious situation surrounding Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and the fact that attacks have not only been directed at the plant, but more recently against an IAEA vehicle and staff. We deplore such attacks and demand that the parties to the conflict take all necessary measures to ensure the safety and security of IAEA staff and property and safeguard the integrity of the plant. Guyana again stresses the urgency of resolving this conflict through peaceful means. The longer it is allowed to continue will only heighten the risk of even graver consequences for all concerned. We further reiterate our call for the Russian Federation to immediately withdraw its military forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine, and for the parties to commit to a serious political and diplomatic process toward ending the conflict. The parties must be encouraged to engage in good faith and to bring an end to the suffering of the millions of men, women, and children in Ukraine and Russia. Pending the outcome of such a process, the parties must prioritize the rule of law and the welfare of civilians. In closing, Guyana stresses the urgency of resolving this conflict through peaceful means. We remain supportive of all efforts of the United Nations Secretary General and other willing partners who have been working diligently toward peace and are prepared to do our part. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President, and I also thank Ms. Houghton for her sobering briefing. During the last 4 weeks, we have continued to witness a steady and increasing escalation in Russia's illegal war of aggression in Ukraine. The list of escalatory measures is deeply concerning. It includes the launch of several missile and drone attacks against Ukrainian cities, including the capital Kyiv, to the deployment of a new ballistic missile on the battlefield. The systematic targeting of Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, in particular energy infrastructure, is unacceptable. These attacks are being conducted with the sole intent of damaging Ukraine's energy capacity amidst the ongoing cold temperatures, with winter only days away. This Council must reiterate in no uncertain terms its call on all parties to fully uphold international humanitarian law, and in particular the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. The international community must stand with Ukraine while it prepares to face another winter engulfed in a conflict with a relentless barrage on its energy infrastructure. President, Malta continues to call for full and unfettered safe access for all humanitarian workers currently operating on the ground in Ukraine. OSHA's updates on the humanitarian needs of the Ukrainian people are sobering. The war has displaced more people in Europe than what we have witnessed since the Second World War. Malta also reiterates its deep concern regarding the provision of military assistance from DPRK and Iran to the Russian Federation, as well as the deployment of troops from the DPRK on the front lines in Ukraine. We call on all states to stop supporting and enabling Russia's illegal war of aggression. We also reiterate the need for full accountability for all crimes committed by Russia and Ukraine and reaffirm our support to the ongoing work of the ICC, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, and the Register of Damage for Ukraine. Furthermore, we reiterate our support for the establishment of a special tribunal for the prosecution of the crime of aggression against Ukraine. President, this Council must redouble efforts and strive to achieve a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine, in line with the UN Charter. During the remainder of our term on the Council and beyond, we will continue to support all efforts aimed at achieving such goals. Until then, Ukraine has the right to defend itself under Article 51 of the UN Charter. We once again call on the Russian Federation to immediately end the war it started and to withdraw all its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank Director Dalton for her briefing. As the crisis in Ukraine drags on, ordinary people have suffered immensely. In conflict areas, many large-scale infrastructures have been damaged. Food, daily necessities, and other daily necessities are severely lacking. And basic public services such as water, electricity, and heating are difficult to guarantee. According to the statistics from OCHA, as a result of the war, more than 14.6 million people in Ukraine are in urgent need of humanitarian assistance, and 3.5 million have been displaced. Less than half of the 2024 humanitarian appeal for Ukraine has been fulfilled. As another winter approaches, people are struggling to survive the war and the severe cold, and the humanitarian situation is very worrying. China once again calls on the parties to the conflict to exercise calm and restraint, strictly observe international humanitarian law, and refrain from attacking civilians and civilian infrastructure. We call on the international community and humanitarian organizations to set up their humanitarian assistance based on the principle of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, so as to ensure the basic livelihoods of displaced persons and that the people in conflict zones can live in peace and warmth during the winter. Recently, the IAEA safety and security team stationed at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant was attacked by a drone during rotation, to which China expresses serious concern. We appreciate Director General Grossi's 7 pillars on the safety and security of nuclear facilities and the 5 principles for the safety of the ZNPP, and urge all parties not to take actions that endanger the safety of nuclear facilities and IAEA staff. President, there is no winner in conflict and war, and military means cannot bring lasting peace. An early ceasefire and a political solution are in the best interest of all parties and is the only feasible way to resolve the crisis. In view of the recent intensification of the war on the ground, I would like to reiterate China's adherence to the 3 principles of no spillover from the battlefield, no escalation of fighting, and no incitement of conflict. Currently, the international community's discussions surrounding the crisis in Ukraine are increasingly focusing on negotiations and moving closer to peace. Some peace ideas and plans have surfaced in the media, and recently both parties to conflict have released political signals towards negotiations. We call on both sides to meet each other halfway and start peace talks at an early date. We call on the international community to provide support and create a favorable condition to form synergy in promoting peace and negotiations, as well as de-escalation. China's position on the Ukrainian issue has been consistent, which is to promote peace, negotiations, and political settlement. We insist on working for peace and promoting talks. We always maintain that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be respected, the purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be observed, and the legitimate security concerns of all countries should be taken seriously. All efforts that are conducive to the peaceful resolution of the crisis should be supported. We have actively engaged in shuttle diplomacy, initiating the establishment of Friends for Peace group on the Ukraine crisis in the UN. With countries of the Global South, such as Brazil, we have only one goal in mind: to mobilize voices for peace, promote consensus for peace, and support efforts for peace. We hope that the dawn of peace will arrive soon, and that the people who have suffered so much from the war will soon return to a life of peace and tranquility. China will continue to make unremitting efforts together with the international community, including the Global South, to achieve a political settlement of the crisis in Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank Ms. Doughton for her briefing, and I welcome the participation of Ukraine and other colleagues in this meeting. President, it is a tragedy and an outrage that once again we are having to address the appalling impacts of Russia's illegal invasion. I'd like to make 3 points. First, the humanitarian cost of Russia's barbaric war has been immense. This year, 14.6 million people, 40% of Ukraine's population, required humanitarian assistance. At least 10,000 civilians have been killed and over 18,500 injured. 6 million Ukrainian refugees are registered across Europe. 3.6 million people are internally displaced in Ukraine. This winter, following a total of 12 major strikes on their energy system in 2024, Ukrainians face limited access to power, water, and heating. The most recent of these came last Friday. Over the course of these attacks, all 3 of Ukraine's operating nuclear power plants have been forced to reduce generation, and millions have been left without power. The targeting of substations providing electricity to nuclear plants directly threatens the safety of Ukraine and the wider region. In this regard, we welcome the resolution adopted by the IAEA's Board of Governors last week. Russia's suggestion to the IAEA is that the solution to the threat that Russia itself is causing is to put the affected power stations into cold shutdown. This cynically ignores the further humanitarian impact this would have on the civilian population. The solution is simpler. Russia should cease these reckless attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure and adhere to the IAEA DG's 7 pillars for nuclear safety and security. Second, President, recent Russian operations have triggered significant displacement in the east, including of the elderly and less mobile, and people with disabilities requiring specialized assistance. People are hiding in basements with no access to services. The humanitarian operating environment remains increasingly difficult. Russia continues to block meaningful access for humanitarian organizations to occupied areas. Over the past 2 months, the number of security incidents directly impacting aid delivery has significantly increased. Third, the UK is providing $126 million in humanitarian aid this year, bringing our total contribution to over $576 million. We have also contributed over $80 million to the Ukraine Energy Support Fund since the start of the full-scale invasion, and committed nearly $467 million in grants and loans overall to the energy sector. Continued provision of air defence to defend Ukraine against Russian strikes remains vital. In conclusion, we call on the Russian Federation to uphold its commitments under the UN Charter by withdrawing its troops from Ukraine and ending this brutal war. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me thank Ms. Lisa Doughton, Director of the Financing and Partnership Division of OCHA, for a very insightful briefing. Nearly 3 years have passed since the onset of the conflict in Ukraine, and the heavy bombardments and airstrikes continue to cause civilian casualties and widespread destruction. Homes, schools, hospitals, and vital civilian infrastructure, including energy systems, have been severely damaged, leading to an ongoing and dire humanitarian crisis. As we enter yet another winter season in Ukraine, Sierra Leone underlines the critical need to address the impact of the conflict on Ukraine's infrastructure, particularly its energy systems, and the immense challenges this poses for civilians during the winter months. According to the Wilson Center, Ukraine is facing a severe energy crisis this winter, exacerbated by attacks on its energy infrastructure in March, April, and in August 2024. With a peak demand of 18 gigawatts on freezing days, that is minus 10 degrees Celsius or 14 degrees Fahrenheit, only 12 to 13 gigawatts will be available. And even with 1.7 gigawatts of potential imports from Europe, there remains a significant shortfall. Daily blackouts could last 10 to 12 hours, with the situation worsening due to further attacks. These prolonged outages will strain critical services, including water supplies, ultimately placing lives at risk. The extreme cold this winter will further exacerbate the toll on the population and put tremendous pressure on an already overstretched healthcare system. The lack of heating, electricity, water, and gas will make daily life unbearable, particularly in high-rise buildings that rely on electricity for elevators and water pumps. This may trigger a renewed wave of internally displaced persons and refugees, as some areas of Ukraine could become uninhabitable. It is also reported that Ukraine's energy infrastructure has been regularly targeted since the start of the conflict in 2022, with significant damage to substations, power plants, and transmission lines. The occupation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant alone has reduced Ukraine's power generation capacity by 6 gigawatts. Madam President, the extent of the damage to Ukraine's energy infrastructure is stark. Since 2022, 18 combined heat and power plants, 800 heating facilities, and critical gas storage systems have been damaged. In 2024 alone, over 400 missile and drone strikes have targeted energy sites, including 7 thermal plants, 4 hydroelectric plants, 17 substations, and a gas storage facility, resulting in a 9-gigawatt loss in capacity. By August 2024, nearly 50% of energy facilities were offline, requiring an estimated $1 billion for repairs. $1 billion, I'm sorry. A major attack in August left 8 million households without power, marking Kyiv's first blackout since 2022. Sierra Leone is thus deeply concerned about the devastating impact this continued targeting of energy infrastructure has had on the provision of essential services to Ukrainian civilians. The International Energy Agency reports that Ukraine faced a significant power deficit over the summer of 2024 when generation capacity fell 2.3 gigawatts short of peak demand, despite electricity imports from neighboring countries. This summer deficit led to daily power cuts across Ukraine, disrupting daily life and economic activity. While Ukrainian citizens have showed resilience in the face of these hardships, the lack of electricity for essential services such as elevators and water pumps has made life increasingly difficult. The full effects of this crisis were partially masked by a warmer weather during the summer. But as winter set in, this situation is going to get worse. Sierra Leone echoes the IEA's assessment that Ukraine's energy infrastructure is extremely fragile heading into this winter season. Despite ongoing repair efforts, much of the lost capacity may not be recoverable, and the pace of repairs may not keep up with the scale of new damage from further attacks. We are thus deeply concerned that further destruction of energy infrastructure will exacerbate the challenges civilians face this winter. According to OCHA's report from 30th October 2024, this winter is expected to be the most difficult for Ukrainians since the conflict began. The harsh winter, which can last up to 6 months, brings temperatures that can drop as low as minus 20 degrees Celsius, with an average range of between minus 4.8 and 2 degrees Celsius. All regions of Ukraine experience temperatures below minus 10 degrees Celsius during winter months. To address these winter-specific needs, the humanitarian community has launched the 2024-2025 Winter Response Plan, appealing for $492.1 million to assist 1.8 million people with critical winter-related support. Sierra Leone calls on the international community to support this plan. Madam President, in light of the devastating impact on civilians, we call on all parties to the conflict to adhere to their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, and to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure, particularly energy facilities. We urge all parties to prioritize the protection of critical infrastructure to prevent further harm and ensure the restoration of essential services for the well-being and stability of the civilian population. We reiterate our call for immediate steps towards a cessation of hostilities and for the parties to engage constructively in good faith to find a political and diplomatic solution that respects the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci. Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to thank Ms. Lisa Doughton from OCHA for her briefing. Over the last 2 years, Switzerland has expressed its views on Ukraine in this chamber on many occasions. The Ukrainian people have always been front and center of our concerns. Today is no exception. Over 14 million people in Ukraine are currently in need of humanitarian aid. The number of civilian casualties has surpassed 40,000. Over 10 million people are either displaced or refugees. Persistent bombardments have created an environment of fear and uncertainty. Winter threatens to exacerbate the humanitarian situation, which is already precarious. While temperatures have dropped below zero, Russian attacks continue to disrupt essential services. Madam President, attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, the latest of which occurred just a few days ago, are particularly disquieting. They have resulted in power cuts across the country, as well as the loss of access to essential services, such as water and heating. Over half of Ukraine's energy facilities have been either destroyed or damaged. Switzerland condemns these systematic large-scale attacks, which may constitute war crimes and/or crimes against humanity. Allow me to highlight three priorities for my delegation. First, respect for international humanitarian law. The principles of distinction, precaution, and proportionality must be respected by all parties to the conflict at all times. Reports from the Human Rights Monitoring Mission and the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine indicate that attacks on electricity infrastructure are likely to violate these fundamental principles. Switzerland calls on Russia to immediately cease these attacks. Accountability for all violations of international humanitarian and international human rights law must be ensured. On this note, we take note of the arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court and reiterate our support for the ICC. Second, addressing humanitarian needs. Months of systematic attacks on civilian infrastructure are threatening access to basic services, severely jeopardizing the supply of water and electricity. Power outages are disrupting daily life throughout the country, affecting millions of people, and disproportionately hitting the most vulnerable, including the elderly, those with disabilities, and internally displaced persons. They are preventing people from accessing education and healthcare, as well as hampering communication. Switzerland is therefore stepping up its efforts to protect the most vulnerable in keeping with the UN's Winter Response Plan for Ukraine. Third, ensuring nuclear safety and security. Damage to Ukraine's energy infrastructure poses a serious risk to nuclear safety. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, has emphasized the need for a stable electricity grid to ensure the safe operation of nuclear facilities. Switzerland urges all parties to fully respect international law as well as to adhere to the 7 pillars for nuclear safety and security, in addition to the 5 principles that we established here in this Council. We reiterate that the safety of all IAEA experts on mission is of the utmost importance. We therefore condemn the attack against them on the 10th of December 2024. Madam President, the repercussions of the war for the Ukrainian population will be felt for months, if not years. Switzerland applauds the tireless efforts of humanitarian actors, including the indispensable contribution made by Ukrainian organizations and volunteers who, often putting their lives in peril, continue to provide vital assistance to people in need. We'd like to pay tribute to over 50 humanitarian aid workers who have been killed or injured in Ukraine this year. We call for full, rapid, safe, and unfettered humanitarian access to all civilians in need, including close to the front line and in the occupied territories. The protection of humanitarian personnel is essential so as to ensure that aid reaches those who need it most. The protection of civilians remains a fundamental priority. We reiterate our call on Russia to end its military aggression and withdraw its troops from all Ukrainian territory. True to its commitment undertaken at the first Ukraine Peace Summit, which took place this summer, Switzerland will continue to support efforts to achieve a just and lasting peace in accordance with the UN Charter. Beyond our mandate here on the Council, the Ukrainian people will remain front and center of our concerns and our support. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to thank the United States for organizing this meeting and Ecuador and France for requesting the meeting. We extend our appreciation to Ms. Lisa Doughton, Director for Financing and Partnerships Division, OCHA, for her insights on this subject. We also welcome the permanent representative of Ukraine at this meeting. Madam President, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine continues to be a source of profound international concern. Its impact extends far beyond immediate military confrontations, manifesting in severe disruption to critical infrastructure, unprecedented geopolitical tensions, systematic violation of international humanitarian law, extensive humanitarian crisis, potential nuclear security risk, the violation of human rights, disrespect for the international legal regime on the protection of civilian population and critical civilian infrastructure highlight the devastating and overmounting impacts of this protracted conflict. The conflict's consequences are particularly acute in Ukraine's energy sector, where civilian populations face extreme vulnerabilities, especially during the challenging winter months. Moreover, the global repercussions include significant energy market volatility, supply chain disruption, and widespread economic uncertainty. Madam President, as long as this conflict drags on, the consequences will inevitably continue to have far-reaching and dramatic consequences on various fronts. We emphasize three fundamental principles. Firstly, all parties must recommit themselves to ensure the protection of civilians, fully adhering to international humanitarian law and the international human rights law, including relevant Security Council resolutions. Secondly, the principles of distinction, precaution, and proportionality must be scrupulously adhered to and upheld by all parties. Thirdly, reaffirming the importance of the International Atomic Energy Agency's 7 pillars for nuclear safety and security during an armed conflict, as outlined by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the 5 principles for ensuring nuclear safety and security at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Madam President, the persistent reliance on military solutions has demonstrably perpetuated a destructive cycle of violence and instability. The harsh reality conclusively shows that the military approaches are neither sustainable nor productive. Continuing to ignore these fundamental truths is no longer tenable. There is no doubt that the time is nigh to give peace a true, genuine chance. This means a resolute commitment to a political solution, prioritizing open dialogue over conflict, and working tirelessly to establish a lasting and just peace. It is against this backdrop that Mozambique, time and again, continues advocating for a political and negotiated solution as the only viable path forward to end this conflict and set the ground for lasting and sustainable peace between the two neighboring countries. In this context, we urgently call for immediate cessation of hostilities, immediate return to direct and meaningful negotiation, prioritizing saving lives and dignity over continued conflict. Finally, the moment has unequivocally arrived to provide peace a genuine opportunity. This demands a resolute commitment to political dialogue, prioritizing diplomatic engagement over military confrontation, and working tirelessly to establish a lasting and just peace between the neighboring countries. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Ms. Stoughton for her sobering briefing. Since the day Russia started its aggression against Ukraine, in a blatant violation of the UN Charter, lives have been upended, cities shattered, and very principle of sovereignty and peace systematically trampled upon. Russia's unprovoked aggression continues to devastate critical civilian infrastructure, particularly Ukraine's energy systems. Last Friday, in a brutal continuation of the massive strikes on November 17th as well as November 27th to 28th, Russia unleashed hundreds of missiles and drones on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. These merciless attacks have caused widespread power outages, leaving millions without electricity or heating, and severely damaged key power plants and substations. We are appalled by the scale of devastation and strongly condemn these attacks by Russia. Such attacks further exacerbate the humanitarian crisis in harsh winter. Alarmingly, this situation has entered a dangerous phase with the deployment of DPRK troops to Russia, now engaged in a combat against Ukraine. We are deeply alarmed by the deepening cooperation between the two. We condemn in the strongest possible terms this unlawful, unjustified, and unacceptable military cooperation, ignoring all the relevant Security Council resolutions. Madam President, the deliberate targeting of energy infrastructure is deplorable and has far-reaching consequences. Beyond energy systems, the ripple effects have impacted other facilities, including medical centers, straining already overstretched emergency services and placing first responders in grave danger from secondary strikes while they carry out life-saving missions. In this context, my delegation is deeply troubled by Russia's clear and persistent disregards of international law, particularly international humanitarian law. Targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure constitutes a flagrant breach of IHL. The global community must ensure that those responsible face justice, holding perpetrators of IHL violations and other egregious acts fully accountable. Madam President, Japan has been unwavering in its commitment to assist Ukraine in addressing the grave challenges stemming from these attacks. Last month, Japan delivered a substantial package of power-related equipment to Ukraine, including gas turbine, 15 variable frequency drives for water pump facilities to Kharkiv city, 2 gas piston cogeneration units for Odessa city, and 32 small-scale power generation to Kharkiv Municipal Agency of Water Resources. These efforts will mitigate the severe impact of winter conditions on civilian population. The international community must act collectively to assist Ukraine in addressing these urgent needs and rebuilding its critical infrastructure. Japan once again strongly demands that Russia withdraw from Ukraine immediately and unconditionally. Japan also affirms its unwavering solidarity with the Ukrainian people and will continue to stand by Ukraine, advocating for the protection of civilians and the restoration of essential services. I thank you.
Representative of Japan for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as representative of the United States. Thank you, Lisa Doughton, for your briefing. In December, the weather in Ukraine hovers below freezing. It's not uncommon for the temperature to drop at night to 4 below Fahrenheit. That's 20 below Celsius. Just 3 years ago, before the country was consumed by Russia's brutal, senseless war, Ukrainians could avoid the snow and the wind and the damp. But now, as Russia continues to attack Ukraine's energy grid, the cold is inescapable. Yet, paradoxically, today, instead of addressing this issue, Russia's PR uses his time to attempt to interpret what he believes to be the policies of the next administration, something that is not in his purview, particularly when he can't explain Russia's own policy of aggression against Ukraine. Since March 2024, Russia has destroyed around half of Ukraine's power generation capacity, leading to rolling blackouts that affect every Ukrainian across the country. Some 3.5 million of those people are living without power at all. For those whose windows and roofs have been lost to Russian strikes, there is little they can do to keep out the frigid air. These attacks, including drone strikes and now cluster munitions, have only increased in frequency these past few months. Just days ago, Russia launched one of the largest area assaults yet, using drones and missiles to target Ukraine's energy grid and other critical infrastructure. In just one day, Russia took out 2 gigawatts of power availability. That's enough power for over 1.5 million homes. Ukraine's energy workers are working heroically to keep their countrymen warm. But despite their efforts and despite assistance from the United States and other international partners, the power generation deficit Russia has created in Ukraine will likely persist long into the next year, leaving Ukrainian households with power outages of up to 20 hours per day. And then there is the potential risk of nuclear disaster posed by Russia's reckless seizure and occupation of Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. Of course, we know the weaponization of energy is just one facet of Putin's war of conquest. Over the past 3 years, Russia has killed more than 12,000 civilians, nearly 28,000 more have been injured, and millions have been displaced in attacks on schools and shops, homes and hospitals. Still others have been forcibly transported into Russia, children, stolen from everything they've ever known, many still missing to this day. As discussed earlier this month, these atrocities were orchestrated and overseen by the highest levels of the Russian government, war crimes and crimes against humanity, unleashed in systematic violation of Russia's obligations under international law to protect civilian life and civilian infrastructure. And Russia is not acting alone. It relies on Iran for drones and other weapons, launching record numbers of Iranian Shahed attack UAVs at Ukraine's power grid. It relies on the DPRK for missiles, ammunition, and soldiers, positioning North Koreans on Russia's front lines under the command of the Russian military. And it relies on China to maintain its war industrial base, supplying it with machine tools, microelectronics, and other weapons components, and to give it political cover, including right here in this council. Thanks to Russia and its enablers, Ukraine is experiencing a humanitarian crisis, but this humanitarian crisis is not limited to Ukraine. Russia's assault on agriculture has threatened food security for tens of millions of the world's most vulnerable, especially in the Sahel. This destruction is compounded by Russia's attacks on merchant ships in the Black Sea and surrounding seaports, which have killed and injured dozens of people and only further impeded delivery of much-needed grain. Innocent Ukrainians, innocent people all across the world are paying the price for this war of conquest. They didn't ask for this war, and they cannot stop it. The one who can is Putin. Putin can at any time end the conflict that has not only killed Ukrainians, but hundreds of thousands of Russians too. Soldiers who could have been home with their families, but instead were tossed into a senseless conflict. It goes without saying, Russia must withdraw its forces from the sovereign territory of Ukraine, and Russia must pay for the damage it has caused in Ukraine through its violations of international law, including international humanitarian law and the UN Charter. Colleagues, I'm not naive. Years of these demands have yet to change Putin's behavior. This is someone who pays no heed to the legal obligations to which his country is bound. This is someone who doesn't care about the human cost of this war, who doesn't care about people freezing or hungry, who doesn't care about the hundreds of thousands of casualties his own people have suffered. And this is someone who has escaped accountability, whose imperial ambition continue despite his abject failure to conquer Ukraine or overthrow its democratically elected government. But I know that while justice in this case may be deferred, it will not be denied. Nations worldwide that value the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, that value justice, that value human lives, stand with Ukraine for a just and lasting peace. And when, not if, but when, Ukraine achieves that just and lasting peace, Russia will need to answer for its unlawful actions. Colleagues, winter has arrived in Ukraine. Its people are bracing for the dark, cold months ahead. But let us be inspired by their resolve, by their willingness to defend their homes, their freedoms, their very identities, even in the most dire of circumstances, and maintain our resolve too. Let us continue to demand Russia end the killing and end the war, and let us stop at nothing to ensure accountability of those who wage it. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of China has asked for the floor to make a further statement, and I give them the floor.
President, you just spoke as the representative of the United States. I would like to briefly respond to that statement. The U.S. has accused China, and this is not in line with the facts. We cannot accept that. The fact is this. The supplier of weapons to the battlefield, trying to prolong the conflict, is the United States itself, not China. China is not a party to the creation of the Ukraine crisis. It's not a party to the conflict itself. Since the outbreak of the conflict, what we have been doing is to call for peace, work for peace, to promote peace talks. I would like to urge the United States to work together with China and the broader international community to end the war as soon as possible in order to pursue a political settlement of the conflict. President, before I conclude, I would like to remind you, respectively, as the U.S. representative, you need to pay attention to the fact that on the Ukrainian issue, the situation has evolved. The U.S. statement should also be updated in line with the changing situation. Thank you very much.
I shall make a further statement in my capacity as representative of the United States. I appreciate China's response to our statement, but our statement was not accusation, it was fact, that China is providing sustenance and support for Russia's efforts in Ukraine. What we all want to see in Ukraine is peace, and that peace is about Putin pulling his troops out of Ukraine. Thank you very much. I resume my function as President of the Council, and I presume that the representative of China has asked for the floor to make a further statement, so I give him the floor.
Thank you, President. I shall be very brief. We have not provided any lethal weapons to any party to the conflict. With regards to the dual-use items, we have exercised strict control. Along with the international community, we are working towards the peace. And this is what we've been doing, and we hope the U.S. will do the same. Thank you. Thank you.
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I now give the floor to the, I'm sorry, I lost my way, to the representative of, of Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, Director Dutton, I also recognize here the residual presence of the Russian delegation in the Soviet seat. as the capo regime who keeps selling you popcorn, today, in a very perverse way, is trying to take on the mantle of the future FBI spokesperson. No doubt that the founder of the FBI, known as Charlie the Crook Chaser, is getting all shook up in his grave, ready to chase the Putin's envoy. We are grateful to France and Ecuador for initiating this meeting to highlight the dire humanitarian consequences of the Russian invasion for the people of Ukraine. The onset of the cold winter season has again exposed the fact that Russia's practice against Ukraine's civilian population amount to acts of genocide. By targeting critical energy infrastructure in an attempt to deprive Ukrainians of electricity, heat, and running water, Russia deliberately inflicts on them living conditions calculated to bring about their physical destruction in whole or in part. Such acts fall under one of the definitions of genocide as per 1948 Convention on the Prevention of and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Last Friday, December the 13th, Ukraine faced one of the largest attacks yet against its energy system. 94 missiles and 193 drones targeted critical energy facilities across the country. It's worth noting that our air defense systems, including F-16 fighter jets, successfully intercepted 84 of these missiles. We reiterate our profound gratitude to all allies who continue to bolster Ukraine's defense capabilities. Their contributions are not only acts of solidarity, but also critical measures in the prevention of genocide, a noble and principled commitment that will be forever held in esteem by history. It is alarming that Russia again targeted facilities crucial for the stable operation of Ukraine's nuclear power plants. 5 out of 9 operating reactors had to reduce power following Friday's attack. It speaks volumes that this happened less than 24 hours after the IAEA Board of Governors adopted its resolution on implications of unstable energy infrastructure critical to safety and security of nuclear power plant. Ukraine is grateful to all states that voted for this document. It is clear, however, that when dealing with Moscow, the strengths of diplomacy must be backed by the strengths of weapons and sanctions. Moreover, as Russia attacks not only Ukrainian energy facilities, but also IAEA convoys, as did on December the 10th on a road in the Zaporizhzhia region. Madam President, last Friday's strike was the 12th carried out by Russia against our energy infrastructure in 2024 alone. For these strikes, Russia used about 1,100 missiles, both cruise and ballistic ones. I reiterate, this is the number of missiles launched against energy facilities only. Russia continues to use munitions containing toxic chemicals, and we have documented 4,950 cases since February 2023. More than 2,000 Ukrainian servicemen suffered from chemical poisoning. Today, the Security Service of Ukraine issued a notice of charges against Russian Lieutenant General Kirillov, who ordered the use of chemical weapons against Ukraine's servicemen. A lot of other deadly weapons remain in Russian stockpiles, mostly from the Soviet times. Guided aerial bombs are among the deadliest. In just 1 week, Russia launched almost 500 guided aerial bombs on Ukrainian positions as well as residential areas of Ukrainian cities. According to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, in September-November alone, Russia's guided aerial bombs killed 108 civilians and injured 755 in Ukraine, representing 25% of all civilian casualties in the period. Modifications of these weapons have extended their range, exposing cities at a distance of several dozen kilometers from the front line to unprecedented threats. Last week, the city of Zaporizhzhia sustained 2 terrorist attacks by Russia. On December the 6th, a guided aerial bomb killed 11 local residents. 8 victims burned to death in their cars following the explosion, including 14-year-old Tanya and 11-year-old Katya. 24 civilians were injured, among them 3 children. In 4 days, on December the 10th, Russia again attacked Zaporizhzhia, this time with Iskander ballistic missile, hitting a private medical facility and nearby buildings. 11 people were killed, including 4 medical workers, and 22 were injured. The Kremlin also deliberately targets humanitarian personnel. Since February 2022, Russian forces have killed at least 99 Ukrainian rescuers and injured about 400 others. The deliberate targeting of civilians, children, and first responders is a war crime, which underscores the need for the international community to hold Russia accountable and to intensify efforts to protect Ukraine's most vulnerable populations. Humanitarian support is vital for Ukraine. We commend the work of the UN humanitarian team in Ukraine and express our gratitude to OCHA, UNHCR, IOM, UNICEF, UNDP, UNEP, UNFPA, and other UN agencies for their active engagement in addressing the ongoing humanitarian crisis. We also deeply appreciate the support provided by our global partners and donors. We call upon them, along with UN agencies and stakeholders, to keep Ukraine at the center of the global humanitarian agenda alongside other affected regions. Madam President, as long as Russia's war of aggression against my country lasts, the ordinary people will bear the heaviest burden. That is why achieving a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter remains a key priority for Ukraine, and I believe the entire civilized world. This vision stands in stark contrast to what Russia demands under the guise of peace proposals. It is a demand to capitulate and voluntarily surrender our sovereignty, and this will never happen. Does anybody believe that Russia is interested in genuine peace while claiming the territories it has occupied and even those it has failed to occupy? It is just testing the strength of the democratic world's resilience, or rather its weakness. And if such weakness is demonstrated in the case of Ukraine, the world should be ready for new waves of Russian aggression sooner rather than later. Moscow will restore its offensive capabilities and learn from its mistakes. And then it will attack again, especially if Ukraine can no longer serve as a shield standing in the way of Russian aggression. The pace of Russia's rebuilding its war machine will depend on how effectively the sanctions are preserved and enforced, or how many loopholes allow Moscow to bypass current restrictions. Fossil fuel exports are a key source of funding for aggressive regimes. In 2023 alone, Russia earned $188 billion from oil exports. Recently, our intelligence released a dossier on 238 participants in a shadow fleet of aging oil tankers. The shadow fleet consists of over 1,000 aging, poorly maintained vessels with convoluted ownership structures. With a combined deadweight of over 100 million tons, roughly 17% of the global oil tanker fleet, it represents a global challenge that literally fuels the Russian war. This shadow fleet is also a real ecological time bomb that could go off at any moment. This was demonstrated yesterday in the Kerch Strait, where 2 Russian tankers were crashed, with one of them simply splitting in half. This disaster caused an oil spill reportedly amounted to 4,000 tons of oil products. Given the poor technical condition of the Russian shadow fleet, the recurrence of such a disaster is only a matter of time if decisive action is not taken to deprive Russia of such a tool. Madam President, as we are approaching the 3rd anniversary of the 3-day military operation, it is obvious that Putin cannot defeat Ukraine militarily. Now he and his generals throw all available reserves onto the battleground in an attempt to grab more lands regardless of the losses. In October and November, Russian losses reached unprecedented levels, exceeding 40,000 soldiers per month. Remarkably, as follows from the Russian statements, these soldiers are dying in Ukraine's Donbass region in a war against the United States, not against Ukraine. Moreover, Russia claims it has been attacked by the United States. You may consider it to be nonsense, and you will be right, but such nonsense circulated most recently by Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov on the sidelines of the OSCE ministerial meeting in Malta, and serves as a calculated purpose. By publicly labeling Ukraine's allies as Russia's primary enemies, the Kremlin sends a message of intimidation. We could do to you what we are doing to Ukraine. Genocidal destruction of energy infrastructure, medium-range ballistic missile strikes. These are the tools to intimidate the free world and discourage it from supporting Ukraine. However, these threats reveal that Putin himself is driven by fear. In truth, he dreads engaging directly with Ukraine's allies. This fear will persist as long as our allies demonstrate unwavering resolve in supporting us, particularly by enabling Ukraine to dismantle Russia's aggressive capabilities, in particular on Russian territory. The only factor that may alleviate his fears is our own weakness and readiness to capitulate, and this will never happen. Putin's envoy may issue threats to this Council and indulge in the delusion of representing a superpower. However, the reality is starkly different. Russia's overextended neo-imperial ambitions are steadily unraveling. The Kremlin's intervention in Syria has culminated in failure, and the collapse of its ventures in Africa will follow. Putin's small victorious war against Ukraine will meet the same ignominious end. He knows this, just as he knows that his portraits will soon be reduced to rags, not only in Syria, but in Russia itself. The world must not succumb to the Kremlin's bluff. Peace can and will be secured through strength, for strength remains the only language that an aggressor comprehends. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Lithuania.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and my own country, Lithuania. We also align ourselves with the statement of the European Union. Russia remains in blatant violation of the UN Charter, disregarding multiple UN General Assembly resolutions, including principles of UN Charter underlying a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine, which was adopted in February 2023 with a majority of 141 votes. Russia also violates the order of International Court of Justice to immediately suspend all military operations in Ukraine. The suffering that Russia continues to inflict on Ukrainian civilians is intolerable. Contrary to its claims, Russia is systematically attacking the civilian population, often targeting rescue and humanitarian workers. In 2024, there were already over 280 incidents involving humanitarian operations and aid workers in Ukraine. We reiterate our appreciation and support for UN humanitarian assistance, the work of UNDP, OCHA, UNICEF, and other agencies, and their devoted representatives in Ukraine engaged in providing support to war-affected populations. Madam President, since 2022, millions of refugees from Ukraine escaping Russia's brutal war aggression have crossed borders into neighboring countries. Out of over 6 million refugees in Europe, more than 130,000 have received refuge in Baltic states. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are working closely with the UNHCR's refugee response plan to ensure critical protection services and humanitarian assistance. The Baltic states strongly condemn and are deeply concerned about Russia's escalating deliberate attacks on the civilian population in Ukraine. We urge Russia to respect its commitments under international humanitarian law, protect civilians and humanitarian personnel in all circumstances. Particular attention should be given to protecting rights, safety, and well-being of Ukraine's children, especially those forcefully deported and illegally adopted in Russia. We demand their safe return and accountability for the perpetrators. According to the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, Russia is expanding its means and methods to target civilians. Verified data reveals a stark escalation. From January through November 2024, modified glide aerial bombs killed 341 civilians and injured 1,803, a threefold increase in fatalities and a sixfold increase in injuries compared to 2023. These aerial bombs carry large amounts of explosive material, making them highly destructive in urban areas. Russia continues to target Ukraine's critical energy infrastructure even as the harsh winter intensifies. In recent attack, Russia launched 93 missiles and 200 drones, including a North Korean missile, at electricity generation and distribution facilities. This resulted in massive power outages, critically impact facilities involved in nuclear power plant electricity conversion and transmission. The International Atomic Energy Agency reported that 5 of Ukraine's 9 operating nuclear reactor units were forced to reduce power output. In total, Russia has already damaged 80% of Ukraine's energy infrastructure. The aim is clear: to destroy the Ukrainian economy and break the resilience of its people. We condemn Russia's deliberate attacks against IAEA staff members, highlighting its complete disregard for international law and the safety of nuclear facilities and personnel. Mr. President, recently there has also been a sharp rise in the executions of Ukrainian prisoners of war by Russian armed forces. The Baltic states demand full accountability, including the implementation of International Criminal Court arrest warrants against Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova over the involvement in the war crimes of child abduction, against Sergei Kobylash and Viktor Sokolov, as well as against Sergei Shoigu and Valery Gerasimov, for war crime of directing attacks at civilian objects and crime against humanity of inhumane acts under the Rome Statute. The Baltic states also reiterate our condemnation of North Korea, Belarus, and Iran for their part in the aggression. We call on all states to cease supporting Russia, including by preventing the provision of dual-use goods. We continue to urge China, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, to exercise its influence and stop Russia's ongoing aggression against Ukraine. We reaffirm our unwavering support for Ukraine's legitimate right to self-defense, as enshrined in the UN Charter. The Baltic states will continue to stand by Ukraine until victory, fully supporting Ukraine's peaceful formula. Our priority is Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and holding Russia and its accomplices, including top political and military leadership, fully accountable. Only a just peace can be truly sustainable. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Lithuania for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sweden.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 5 Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and my own country, Sweden. We thank OCHA for yet another alarming briefing. We commend the bravery and professionalism of all humanitarian workers. Mr. President, Russia's aggression against Ukraine has caused immense human suffering. According to UNHCR, there are nearly 4 million internally displaced in Ukraine, and 6.8 million refugees from Ukraine have been recorded globally. With sub-zero temperatures, a staggering 14.6 million people in Ukraine are currently in need of humanitarian assistance. Over the weekend, we saw yet another Russian wave of missile attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Not only does this expose civilians, hospitals, and schools to the harsh winter conditions, it endangers the safety and security of Ukraine's nuclear sites, as these require a secure off-site power supply. Throughout the war, Russia has shown a blatant disregard for international humanitarian law. Humanitarian access to occupied areas has been denied, civilians and civilian objects have been consciously targeted, children have forcefully been abducted, and prisoners of war have been systematically tortured. Mr. President, these countless violations of international humanitarian law illustrate that Russia has chosen terror to achieve its political goal, the subjugation of Ukraine and the annexation of sovereign Ukrainian territory. Over the years, we have heard different Russian attempts to justify its aggression. Claims that Ukraine or NATO were poised to attack Russia served only one purpose: to hide the simple truth that Russia's actions were nothing but a violation of international law and the UN Charter. Mr. President, as the aggression continues, we need to remind ourselves that this is a Russian war of choice. Russia could end it tomorrow. The international community must remain firm in its support for a just and sustainable peace in line with international law, the UN Charter, and relevant GA resolutions. Any illusion that Russia advocates a more equitable, just, and fair world must be dispelled. When the international community sought to revitalize multilateral cooperation through the Pact for the Future, Russia attempted to derail it. When Ukraine prepared grain shipments to mitigate the global consequences of the aggression, Russia cynically targeted ships and port infrastructure in Odessa to stop the deliveries. Mr. President, Ukraine and its partners have been ready for peace since day one. However, a settlement where aggression is rewarded or where independent states are denied the right to decide its own security arrangements risks being neither sustainable nor conducive to international peace and security. Until a comprehensive, just and sustainable peace has been reached in line with international law and the UN Charter, we demand that Russia ensures safe, timely, and unimpeded humanitarian access to the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. We demand that Russia cease its attacks on civilians and civilian objects, and we demand that Russia allows the UN and the ICRC to visit Ukrainian prisoners of war. Mr. President, Russia's aggression and violations of international humanitarian law must come to an end. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sweden for her statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, head of the delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Georgia, as well as Andorra and Monaco, align themselves with this statement. I thank OCHA for its briefing. It reminded us of the devastating humanitarian toll of Russia's war of aggression. The EU commends the courage and professionalism of all humanitarian workers risking their lives to alleviate human suffering. Friends, in the coming weeks, many families in Ukraine would traditionally be celebrating the holidays together in the safety and warmth of their homes and loved ones. But for far too many, this period will instead be marked by mourning for lost friends and family members. For them, that is the reality of the illegal war. We once again call on Russia to immediately and unconditionally cease its large-scale and systematic attacks against Ukraine's civilian and energy infrastructure. Russia's plan to weaponize energy in order to pressure the Ukrainian people is unacceptable. This year, civilian casualties are at their highest level since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. According to OHCHR, at least 12,000 have been killed. Deliberately targeting civilians or civilian infrastructure is a war crime. These attacks also endanger nuclear safety and security, as nuclear sites need a secure off-site power supply. In the territories it currently occupies, Russia's large-scale human rights violations are well documented, including by the UN. We have also frequently heard in this chamber how Russia has cut off an estimated 1.5 million Ukrainians from humanitarian aid. We call on it to respect its obligations under international law in the territories it temporarily occupies and facilitate full, safe, and rapid and unimpeded humanitarian access. We are equally alarmed at Russia's treatment of Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilian detainees, as many others mentioned in this room. The UN has confirmed widespread and systematic torture and ill treatment, including sexual violence. There are numerous reports of executions by Russian forces. The European Union condemns prisoners' lack of access to the outside world and the denial of access for ICRC and other independent monitors. International humanitarian law, including the Third Geneva Convention, must be fully respected. We reiterate that Russia and its leadership must be held fully accountable for waging this war of aggression and for other crimes under international law, such as the ones I've mentioned. Humanitarian action in these winter months is particularly important, both within Ukraine and among Ukrainian refugee populations in neighboring states. As is the case for all crises around the world, the EU and its member states continue to contribute generously. We call on all nations to step up their support as well. In Ukraine, we are providing an additional winter support package to repair damaged energy infrastructure, to improve connectivity within Ukraine and from the EU, and to stabilize the energy system. In line with a long history of support for mine clearance, we are also increasingly humanitarian mine action, taking into account that Ukraine is one of the countries most affected by landmines and that the risks to civilians, especially children, are amplified when these dangers are buried under snow and ice. We urge third countries to cease all assistance to Russia's war of aggression. This includes not only direct military support, but also a provision of dual-use goods and sensitive items that sustain Russia's military-industrial base. The EU strongly condemns the deepening military cooperation between the DPRK and Russia. The deployment of DPRK troops in Russia's illegal war of aggression blatantly violates UN Security Council resolutions. It represents a unilateral hostile act by the DPRK at the reckless invitation of Russia, with grave consequences for European and global peace and security. President, in closing, during these cold winter days and nights, our thoughts go out to the brave, resilient Ukrainian families suffering an illegal and unprovoked foreign aggression and exercising their inherent right to self-defense. No one wants peace more than the Ukrainians. As the new year arrives, now more than ever, we urgently need not any peace, but a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace anchored in the UN Charter. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Lambrinidis for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, I would like to thank Madam Lisa Doughton from UNOCHA for her informative briefing. It is very clear that the humanitarian situation in many areas of Ukraine continues to deteriorate due to Russia's deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure. This war has affected millions of people, including the most vulnerable groups, and forced them to flee their homes because Russia deliberately wishes so. What worries us the most is that Russia continues its relentless attacks on Ukraine's critical infrastructure, including energy, heating and water supply systems, healthcare and emergency services. These attacks are inflicted both by the physical missile strikes and as well as the cyber attacks. The destruction of energy infrastructure makes living conditions of Ukrainians uneatable this winter, and countless schools, hospitals and homes have no heating or running water, as we heard today. We call on Russia to stop these attacks immediately. We remind the Russian leadership that international law prohibits the intentional targeting of civilian infrastructure essential for the survival of the civilian population. Deliberately targeting civilians or civilian infrastructure is a war crime. We are concerned by the horrific treatment of the Ukrainian POWs and civilian detainees that has been confirmed by numerous human rights mechanisms, such as the UN Commission on Inquiry on Ukraine, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, and the OSCE Moscow mechanisms. We are also appalled at the daily reports of the crimes committed by the Russian forces, including widespread and systematic torture, ill treatment, sexual violence, arbitrary arrests and detentions, and the forcible transfers and the deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia, where they are being coerced to accepting Russian citizenship. This all violates basics of the international humanitarian law. Mr. President, Poland supports all multilateral and national efforts to hold Russia accountable for these violations and through relevant judicial institutions and compensation mechanisms. The humanitarian response is facing increasingly challenges due to safety risks and worsening conditions on the ground. We call for additional mobilization of efforts to support all humanitarian actors operating in Ukraine, including UN-affiliated agencies, international organizations, and the local NGOs. Urgent assistance is needed to rebuild power grids, as well as heating and water systems, conduct humanitarian demining, and to provide supplies for repairing and strengthening shelters. We must prioritize humanitarian access and ensure protection for persons in vulnerable situations, including women, children, and persons with disabilities, and provide comprehensive support for rebuilding efforts in Ukraine. As a close neighbor, we are focused on helping Ukraine that is struggling with the unlawful aggression mainly directed against civilian population. Since 2022, Poland has delivered assistance to nearly 4 million Ukrainians that crossed our borders immediately after the start of the Russian full-scale invasion. We have served as a medical, energy, and logistical hub for the transfer of the EU aid to Ukraine and provided energy support before winter. We have also financially contributed to various programs and funds, including the Ukrainian Humanitarian Fund, UNHCR, UNICEF, WFP, and ICRC. To conclude, Poland is fully determined and will not give up on elevating humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. We will provide further support to our neighbors in need. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for his statement. Excuse me. And I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Paul Beresford Hill, Permanent Observer of the Sovereign Order of Malta to the United Nations.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues. My gratitude to the United States for calling this meeting and to the distinguished representatives from France and Ecuador for their interest and their commitment to the humanitarian concerns of the people of Ukraine, and to Ms. Lisa Doughton for her very, very inspiring and very, very relevant briefing. Since the onset of the conflict in Ukraine, the Sovereign Order of Malta has been at the forefront in providing humanitarian aid to the Ukrainian population. Our work there has impacted over 4 million individuals, resulting in the disbursements of over 60 million euro in aid and resources delivered and distributed in over 70 locations. At the moment, we have over 1,000 volunteers and relief workers active in Ukraine, providing humanitarian aid to those in need. We recently held a conference at our government headquarters in Rome to review humanitarian operations in Ukraine, and we heard from doctors, volunteers, psychologists, and other professionals who are working with us throughout the country. I'd like to share with you one takeaway from that conference. Relentless bombing, the destruction of infrastructure, and the fear of repeated hostilities, coupled with the absence of adults, either deceased or serving in the armed forces, is creating a generation of traumatized Ukrainian children whose futures will be marked by evolving mental health issues. Any child psychologist will tell you that children need a healthy, safe, and secure environment in order to grow, not only physically, but mentally. Across the world, we have become aware of the sheer immensity of mental health issues, particularly as they affect young people. The US National Institute of Mental Health reports that almost 50% of teenagers struggle with mental health issues, while 22% of those have severe impairment. Similar statistics are reported in many countries. Now, these statistics reflect young people raised in relatively safe environments who do not experience the effects of war or internal conflict. Imagine, therefore, the immense damage being done to children and youth in war-ravaged environments as experienced across Ukraine. Order of Malta psychosocial professionals have worked with tens of thousands of Ukrainian young people over the past 2 years in a variety of social and therapeutic environments, and continually report on the underlying traumas and anxieties that are shaping the worldview of these children, who soon will be adults. Summer camp opportunities, play centers, group and individual counseling can only do so much, because as long as bombs are dropping and homes destroyed, with families living in fear, and as long as the country is focused away from the normal affairs of state, then the emotional and psychological future of the country will be at risk. According to the Ukrainian government, more than 3,800 educational facilities in the country have been damaged or destroyed, severely interrupting access to education for millions of children. Only 2 out of 700 schools in Kharkiv are delivering in-person learning. Most children there are studying online. Others attend classes in 5 metro stations that have been converted into underground schools. The rebuilding of cities and towns will happen over time. The rebuilding of lives and minds is a far more complex process. We can only begin when we have peace. But we also know that while bodies heal or adjust, establishing mental equilibrium is an ongoing process that often takes a lifetime. The sooner we find a peaceful solution to the conflict, the sooner the next generation of Ukrainians will find its way. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Beresford Hill, for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.